Live from Washington, D.C., this is Balance of Power with Joe Mathieu and Kailey Leinz.
But when will they vote? Welcome to the Friday edition of Balance of Power. As the Department of Justice drops its investigation into Fed Chair Jay Powell, possibly ending the standoff that has delayed the process to replace him. I'm Joe Mathieu alongside Kailey Leinz in Washington. We're glad you're with us here on this Friday. The question, of course, Kailey, is when will a confirmation vote for Kevin Warsh be scheduled?
Yeah, knowing that they have until mid-May, that is when Chairman Jerome Powell's term is set to expire and when they would like to see Kevin Warsh be ready to take the helm at the Federal Reserve. Of course, there has to be certain notification in the Banking Committee, so it's going to be a number of days before this vote can happen in the first place. And of course, we have yet to hear from the man who was holding this all up. Republican Senator Thom Tillis of North Carolina said he would not vote to confirm Kevin Warsh until the criminal probe was wrapped up. Now that it is he ready to cast that vote? He hasn't said that affirmatively yet.
That's
today.
correct. And we actually still haven't heard from Powell himself either, whether he will leave the Fed when this is done. President Trump, you would have thought, be posted on Truth Social about the man he calls too late Powell, but we haven't had a peep yet. Tyler Kendall will bring us up to date in a moment from the White House. Yeah,
and we're going to get more from Bloomberg's Michael McKee, who covers international economics and policy for us as well. Plus an important conversation coming up in just a few moments with Congresswoman Suzan DelBene of Washington. She chairs the DCCC. It's her charge to get more Democrats elected to the House of Representatives. And given the redistricting news we've gotten just this week, it'll be very important to hear from her on how she's viewing things in November.
We've got some heavy hitters for you this hour. We will get to Iran as well later in the program as we keep our eyes on Wall Street here in the Friday trade.
Yes, indeed. You know who always has an eye on that?
I do.
Charlie Pellet in New York. So let's go up to him now. Charlie, happy Friday.
Happy Friday. But for anybody hoping for a quiet Friday, anything but, and isn't that always the case? We have got the Dow Industrials slumping, but the S&P, NASDAQ, they are both advancing. All of this as the Justice Department ends a controversial investigation into building renovation cost overruns by the Fed, potentially clearing a path to confirmation for Kevin Warsh, as we have been reporting. And coming up in just a moment, we'll be hearing from our Michael McKee. So here's where we stand in terms of the numbers. S&P right now up 53. That is a gain of 0.7%. We do have the Dow Industrials down 139 now, down by about 0.3%, while NASDAQ is up 377 for the NASDAQ Composite Index, a gain right now of 1.5%. All of this with the VIX below 19, the SOX up another 4.5%. We have got the 10-year yielding 4.30% and the all-important 2-year 3.77%. Gold up $33 the ounce to $47.28, up by 0.7%. West Texas Intermediate crude retreating on optimism about Mideast talks, down now by 2.4% on WTI, 93.57 a barrel. Barrel of Brent right around 104, down by about 0.4%. Keeping an eye on Intel shares, impossible to ignore today after last night's earnings report, up today by 20.5%. Highest level ever among other chip names. We have got Texas Instruments retreating after this week's surge, down 1.9%. NVIDIA up 4.8%. Broadcom up by 0.2%. For on-demand news, 24 hours a day, subscribe to Bloomberg News Now wherever you get your podcast. Joe and Kailey, that's a Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, Charlie Pellet checking on the Friday trade for us. Thank you very much. And it wouldn't be a Friday if we didn't get some news that we weren't necessarily expecting, keeping in mind that it was, just 24 hours ago, Joe, we were still hearing from the U.S. Attorney here in D.C., Jeanine Pirro, that she was pushing ahead.
Staying in
with
her
the
lane.
Criminal probe into Chairman Powell. She was looking at this from a legal perspective and the idea of cost overruns at the Federal Reserve Building and renovations here in Washington. Fast forward to earlier today, and it's dropped. It's handed over to the Fed's Inspector General.
The president, in 2 separate interviews over the past week, said, no, I want to know I want to see the results of this investigation. We're not taking our foot off the gas. To your point, Judge Jeanine yesterday saying she's staying in her legal lane. But something happened here, and we can't deny the pressure campaign that has brought us to this moment.
Yeah, specifically pressure being driven by one Republican senator in particular, Thom Tillis of North Carolina.
As you mentioned, we haven't heard a statement or seen a statement from Thom Tillis. You know who spoke with him quite recently is Bloomberg's Tyler Kendall. She's back at the White House today, where we're also waiting to hear from the administration officially on this. Tyler, what needs to come next? We hear from a senator from North Carolina. We get a confirmation vote date. You tell us.
Well, Joe, both of those things are action items that need to happen in order to pave the way for Kevin Warsh's nomination, though we had heard previously from Senator Thom Tillis earlier this week. As you mentioned, I had the chance to catch up with him, where he said that this specific criminal investigation into allegations that Powell misled the Senate Banking Committee when it came to cost overruns of renovations at the Fed's headquarters here in Washington had to be dropped, and that is what happened. The question here, though, becomes if Tillis takes a position like we've heard from some Democratic lawmakers who have criticized the probe, like Senator Elizabeth Warren putting out a statement earlier today saying that all legal matters into Federal Reserve officials, including Fed Governor Lisa Cook, should be resolved. It would appear, though, that there was momentum for an off-ramp to happen. We heard earlier this week from Tillis that he would still support some sort of investigation into the cost overruns of the Fed's renovation projects, just not the allegations that Powell had any sort of criminal intent when he spoke to Congress about those cost overruns. So that's a really important distinction that we have to make. We'll see if we hear from President Trump. We know, of course, that he is no stranger to the criticism when it comes to Fed Chair Jerome Powell, amid questions about what this will also mean for Powell's tenure as his chairmanship ends May 15th, but of course his governorship doesn't till 2028.
All right, Bloomberg's Tyler Kendall live at the White House. Thank you so much. And I think Tyler might be now making a run for it, as the White House press secretary, Caroline Leavitt, is gaggling with reporters on Pebble Beach, just behind where Tyler was standing. And she is addressing talks that will be taking place with Iran. Just to bring you some of the headlines, she confirmed earlier reporting we had seen from CNN that the president's envoys, Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner, will be leaving tomorrow morning for talks in Pakistan. Caroline Leavitt says the Iranians reached out and asked for in-person talks, and that the vice president, J.D. Vance, is deeply involved and standing by. Our understanding is he will not be present for this round of talks, given the Iranian Speaker of the Parliament, which the U.S. sees as being essentially the lead negotiator on the Iranian side, is not going to be in attendance at this particular round, Joe.
She's on Fox News at the moment. I guess she's going to make her way to the driveway. We might get some news here, Kailey, on Jay Powell as well and the reaction to the Department of Justice. We do have a statement now from Tim Scott, which just dropped into our email boxes here. As I've said from the beginning, this is, of course, the chair of Senate Banking Committee. This is the body that would vote to confirm the next Fed chair. The American people deserve answers about the unacceptable cost overruns at the Federal Reserve. These serious concerns warrant scrutiny, he writes. And I am pleased this matter is continuing to receive it. I welcome the Inspector General's review and expect a full accounting of how these costs spiraled out of control. The Senate Banking Committee will continue conducting aggressive oversight to ensure taxpayers get the transparency and accountability they deserve. And I am inviting the Inspector General to brief the committee within the next 90 days on its findings. The Federal Reserve should be focused on price stability, not costly mismanagement, said Chairman Scott. I don't see a date here for a confirmation vote. And we want to bring Michael McKee into this conversation. Bloomberg's international economics and policy correspondent, of course, spends a lot of time in Washington with us because he covers the Fed for us. Mike, what do you make of this statement, and does it allow for Kevin Warsh to potentially be the chair at the next Fed meeting?
It does. The question is it going to be enough for Thom Tillis to let the vote go forward? If Tillis is satisfied with what they have compromised on, then Kevin Warsh will be most likely the chair at the June Fed meeting and probably take over as chair shortly after Jay Powell leaves on May 15th. The other question, though, is whether Powell leaves the Board of Governors and whether this is enough for him. And what we don't know is what he thinks or what his lawyers think of the fact that Jeanine Pirro is promising that she could come back and file charges again, depending on what the Inspector General's report says. And, of course, if the report doesn't necessarily say that there's criminal activity, remember what Judge Boasberg said. The initial complaint that they put out in their subpoenas was pretextual. So she could easily do that again just to harass the Fed chair when he's out of office and when Warsh is already chair. So a lot of questions left unsaid, left unanswered.
Well, including as well left unanswered is the question around Fed Governor Lisa Cook, which it wasn't addressed in this Pirro statement, Mike. So how should we be reading into that?
Well, there's not much Tim Scott can say about a decision the Supreme Court has to make that they haven't handed down yet. That could come at any time, although our court watchers at Bloomberg News say maybe a little bit longer. We have to wait for that. But if the court allows the firing to go ahead while they take the rest of Cook's case through courts, which they haven't even started the process of, then they, in theory, could do the same with Jay Powell. And if he doesn't leave as a member of the Board of Governors, you have to expect that the president might try to fire him. But there's not much point in the president doing that now if the court's going to rule in favor of Lisa Cook. So we are going to have to wait on that and see what the impact is.
All right. Bloomberg's Mike McKee, thank you so much covering this breaking news for us all day long here on Bloomberg TV and radio. And as we consider cases that are currently sitting in court, the Supreme Court of the United States itself, of course, still has yet to make a ruling pertaining to the Voting Rights Act that could affect House district maps, especially in the South. And the Virginia State Supreme Court is now going to be dealing with the Virginia redistricting that did pass in a special vote just this past Tuesday. Virginia voters allowing a redrawing of the map that would make it a 10-to-1 split. 10 Democrats, 1 Republican seat likely in its congressional map ahead of the midterms. So we'll see how these courts decide and how it will impact ultimately the various parties as they chart their way forward into November. And of course, the woman in charge of doing that for the Democrats is Congresswoman Suzan DelBene of Washington, who is the chair of the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee. And she is joining us now here on Bloomberg TV and radio. Congresswoman, it's always great to have you. First, if we could begin with Virginia, what is your degree of confidence that in the state Supreme Court, this map that so favors the Democrats will be upheld?
I think it's going to be upheld because the court is going to uphold the will of the people. The people had a vote, and unlike what you've seen with Republican redistricting in places like Texas, what they're looking at doing in Florida, that has not gone to the people. The people have not had an opportunity to have their voices heard. But in California, the people were clear. And in Virginia, the people's voice was clear, too. So I think the court is going to uphold the will of the people, and these maps will stand. And because people are tired of Republicans trying to rig the system, they want to elect their representatives, not have politicians pick their voters.
So what's your feeling about this, Congresswoman? After months and months of hand-wringing and court cases and a lot of fear initially among Democrats when President Trump got this whole ball rolling in Texas, we're now in a world in which I don't know what will happen in Florida and how Ron DeSantis might get his arms around this, but we could be in a world where it's either a wash or Democrats end up with at least one extra seat than Republicans. So, I mean, are you guys laughing about this behind the scenes? Is this a big eye roll? Because it sure seemed to be a waste of time.
Well, we were clear from the very beginning. Be careful what you ask for. We are going to fight back with everything we have because the American people hate this. The people of Texas hated it. They did get a say. The people of California were very clear and responded strongly that they want to fight for fair elections. And you know, if Republicans were winning in the hearts and minds of the American people, they knew that voters were on their side, they wouldn't be going down this path. They're going down this path because people have soured on the Republican agenda. They know they're losing. Instead of listening to people and understand the damage their policies are having on working families across the country, they've decided that they're going to instead try to rig the system in their favor. And people have responded strongly all across the country. I mean, Missouri, another state that they're trying to change the maps, there are signatures to take it to a referendum, take it to the voters, and Republicans are doing everything they can to prevent that. Florida has a law in place, and yet Governor DeSantis is trying to go around, once again, a amendment voted on by the people of Florida that would tell them not to do redistricting. They're going to try to do it anyway. So every time we have gone to the voters, they've decided, and I think that's the message across the board. People are tired of the games Republicans are playing, and they want folks who are going to stand up for them.
Well, when we consider the game that is being played and the precedent it is now setting, Congresswoman, are you concerned at all that what we're seeing happen is and we were talking about this with former Obama campaign manager Jim Messina on this show just yesterday, that you're seeing more solidly Republican and more solidly Democratic districts and very few swing districts as a result of this. Swing districts are your focus. I think you're targeting more than 40 of them in this election cycle. What happens if there's not going to be as many flippable seats going forward?
Well, I think that's what Republicans have done, even in their gerrymandering in Texas. They ended up thinking they were creating safe seats, and we have opportunities to pick up seats in Texas because we've been, people have soured on the Republican agenda. They have struggled with rising costs, with the instability and uncertainty in the economy that has been brought on by Trump and Republicans in Congress. And so we've seen huge overperformance in special elections across the country by Democrats because people are speaking out. So those districts that you might have at one point said were kind of safe districts, lots of those districts are in play. We have 44 districts across the country where we're on offense, and we have great candidates running, and we only need 3 more seats to net 3 more seats to take back the gavels, which we will in November.
We'd like to talk to you, Congresswoman, about the money and the messaging, and I'll start with the money. Do you care at this point about these numbers? The RNC alone has $109 million on hand versus the DNC, which is looking at debt, and the NRCC too has a cash advantage over the DCCC. Does that matter if you think you're winning on the message?
We have been working incredibly hard to make sure that we are getting our message out, and we are. Our candidates and our incumbents in swing districts have been strong fundraisers. They have an advantage over their opponents across the board. We are in a strong position. And yes, they have a lot of money. You see Trump raising money into his own super PAC. We are going to have the resources that we need to get our message out across the country. And we have incredible candidates. They don't have a message, they don't have the candidates, and the American people want folks who are going to stand up for them. So I think we are absolutely in a strong position across the board, and we will take back seats all across the country.
Well, as you talk about standing up for the American people on these various issues, Congresswoman, of course, Democrats tried to take a stand when it comes to the funding of ICE and CBP. We have seen the Department of Homeland Security shut down for, 70 days as a result of that. But now the Republicans are moving forward with a budget reconciliation package to fund those very agencies for the next 3.5 years. And Democrats don't have many reforms to ICE enforcement to show for it. Congresswoman, is that going to be disappointing to the electorate you're talking about?
People across the board want there to be reforms. They've seen the violence in communities across the country, and we're going to stand up for those reforms. I don't know if Republicans know what the heck they're doing. They don't even agree with each other. They have created a shutdown, including on places where there was bipartisan agreement to make sure there was funding for Coast Guard, for FEMA, for TSA, and yet Republicans were incapable of even opening up those parts of DHS. So they're continuing to fumble in some direction. We'll see what they do, but we're going to continue to stand up. We should be making sure that the government is open, and we should be making sure that we have an agency following the law that is making sure that they are not creating violence in our communities across the country. That's what we're standing up for, and that's what the American people want to see.
It's good to have you back, Congresswoman. Suzan DelBene, Democrat from Washington, chairs the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee. Madam Chair, thank you, as always, for the insights. We'll assemble our political panel next. I'm Joe Mathieu alongside Kailey, Leinz in Washington. This is Bloomberg.
Hey, it's 121 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. And as we have been reporting, the Justice Department is ending a controversial investigation into building renovation cost overruns by the Fed, potentially clearing a path to confirmation for Kevin Warsh. Also, President Trump is sending 2 envoys, Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner, to Pakistan to talk with Iranian officials. Right now, we have got the price of crude oil retreating. WTI down 2% right now at $93.80 a barrel. Brent crude also falling 104.70, down now by 0.3%. Bottom line here, U.S. stocks are trading mixed with the Dow lower, down 169, down 0.3%. 1%, but the S&P on track for another weekly gain. Also on track for a record. S&P at 7152 now, up 43 points, up 0.6%. NASDAQ is surging 1.4%. This is Intel rallies after earnings. Intel up now by 19.5%. The VIX below 19 with a 10-year, 4.31. The closely watched 2-year, 3.78%. Gold up 0.6%, 47.23 the ounce. WTI, as we mentioned, down now by 2.1%. Amazon and Meta Platforms have struck a multi-billion-dollar deal for Meta to rent hundreds of thousands of Amazon's general-purpose chips for its AI efforts. And by the way, both companies will be reporting next week. Again, recapping, stocks higher, S&P up 43 right now, up by about 0.6%. And for on-demand news, 24 hours a day, subscribe to Bloomberg News Now, wherever you get your podcasts. Joe and Kailey, that is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, Charlie Pellet, thank you very much indeed. Welcome back to Balance of Power on this Friday. Thank you for being here on Bloomberg TV and radio as we deal with the breaking news here in Washington that the U.S. Attorney here in D.C., Jeanine Pirro, has dropped her criminal investigation into the chair of the Federal Reserve, Jerome Powell, over the renovations to the Fed's building here. But the White House press secretary says it's not necessarily dropped. In the words of Caroline Leavitt, it's just being moved over. And I guess in some way, Joe, that is true, as it's now the Fed's Inspector General, someone who was appointed by Chairman Powell, mind you, and asked to lead this investigation internally in the Fed last year, is now going to be taking the charge on this.
Yeah, this is interesting. I don't know. We haven't seen or heard anything from Jay Powell. Will he want to guarantee that this investigation will not follow him into his retirement? That's unclear. We haven't heard from Tom Tillis either. So we've got the makings for a stepping off here, an ending of an investigation, even if Judge Jeanine says it's just moving. There was hope that the committee, the Senate Banking Committee, or some other entity in Congress might take this on and just get it out of the hands of the DOJ where it was a criminal investigation. Caroline Leavitt didn't tell us a lot to bring the clarity. And, you know, we spend, Kailey, a couple of moments every week with our good friend David Weston, and we ask him impossible questions, questions you couldn't possibly answer about what's going on inside Donald Trump's head. Today, David, it's what's going on inside Tom Tillis's head, or Jay Powell. Of course, our dear friend is the host of Bloomberg Wall Street Week and spends a heck of a lot of time and has over the course of his career covering the Fed. And I'm just wondering what questions we should be asking now, David. If not, when does the committee vote?
Well, the one thing I infer from all this is both sides want to get out of this. They just can't quite figure out how. I mean, given the fact that Jeanine Pirro, the U.S. Attorney, was trying to pull out, she couldn't help herself but to add that part at the end that says, by the way, I may come back with it again, you know, just so that it couldn't be clean. I don't know what's going on, certainly inside President Trump's brain, but for me, it would be, oh, come on, please. I mean, I'm trying to get this behind us, and you try to make it a mess. And we'll see. I think part of the dynamic here, you both know this so well, is having gone this far, then Jay Powell's in a position where he doesn't want to step down and make it look like it was a quid pro quo for something that he never did. He believes, and most people agree, he didn't do anything wrong, certainly not criminally wrong in doing it. But how do we do that so that it's not hanging over his head? It's a sort of a sad situation that they can't quite get out of, but I'm sure they will.
Well, I have to say, I personally am very much looking forward to the press conference that Chairman Powell will be giving after the Fed's rate decision next Wednesday. Those questions are going to be super fun for him to handle, I am sure. Just like, of course, his presumed successor, David, was the one facing questions from senators, specifically at the confirmation hearing this week. We learned a lot about the way Kevin Warsh is thinking about things, how he'd like to see regime change at the Fed. But interestingly, we also heard from him, he was questioned about how he's viewing the economic impact of artificial intelligence, the way it's going to impact productivity and, by extension, the labor market. I believe it was Senator John Kennedy who said, I would just be a little wary of these companies who might be looking to IPO and are hyping up what this technology will be capable of doing. I know you're getting into that on Wall Street Week this week. What do we need to know as we're facing down the risks that we're all told are present from the likes of Anthropic's Mythos? Yeah,
it was interesting what Kevin Warsh had to say about AI, because he I think it's trying to figure out a way that he could cut rates, and the way he can do that because of AI is to say it's going to increase productivity so much that it'll make everything cheaper. In the short term, however, it's going to be more investment, which could drive up that neutral rate rather than down. But as you suggest, Kailey, it was also another aspect of AI that's involving the Fed. As if Jay Powell didn't have enough on his platter, we also had he and Scott Bessent, the Treasury Secretary, call in the heads of the big banks with this anthropic mythos, a new system that apparently can just run in the background and find all kinds of vulnerabilities in any computer system that nobody's seen before and could potentially lead to some cybersecurity threats. So we wanted to take a look at that, and we turned to Kate Judge. As you know, she teaches at Columbia, and she is a specialist in the Fed. So we asked her, why was it so important that the Treasury Secretary and the chair of the Fed call in the banks to try to really warn them about this coming? This is part of what she had to say.
The big deal is there are real concerns that this new, much more sophisticated form of AI could detect and likely will detect very meaningful vulnerabilities in banks' software in ways that could expose them to cyber attacks that would disable individual banks and potentially the broader banking system.
What exactly can the Federal Reserve do? They have an awful lot of PhD economists. I'm not aware they have a lot of AI engineers.
Yeah, I mean, one of the real challenges, no bank supervisor is prepared for this, right? So cyber attacks are nothing new. It's a challenge banks have been dealing with for a long time. And supervisors have played a role helping to make sure that banks are appropriately prepared as part of operational risk and other concerns. But this is a whole different level. It's jumping up the magnitude of the threat in a way that no bank regulator or supervisor is prepared to fully address. And so the question is, can they ask good questions? Can they help provide guidance? As they did in Washington, can they facilitate coordination and conversation?
You turn to the Fed right now to avoid the problem. But if, heaven forbid, there is a problem, there is a serious hack, what could the Fed's role be in remediation?
This is one of the key issues. I mean, the government's not going to be able to stop a serious cyber attack. On the other hand, the government can play a very meaningful role helping to contain the damage.
So that's Kate Judge from Columbia. And I did think that last point she made was one I had not thought of, which is even if the Fed can't stop it, prevent it, they've got to be thinking about what happens if, in fact, there is a big cyber attack. How can we make sure that the system stays up and running?
It's a very important line of questioning to be asking. And of course, you can find that full conversation on this week's episode of Wall Street Week with its host, David Weston. David, thank you as always for being here with us on Balance of Power on this Friday as we preview it. And joining us now here on Balance of Power is today's political panel. Lester Munson is with us, Republican strategist and head principal of the international practice at BGR Group, alongside Bloomberg Politics contributor Adam Hodge, Democratic strategist and managing partner at Bully Pulpit International. Great to have you both here. Lester, if we could just start with you on what we were discussing with David a moment ago, the dropping of the probe, the criminal probe at least, into Chairman Powell. The White House is characterizing this as a probe just being moved over. Are you surprised we haven't heard from President Trump himself on this, given how vocally critical he has been of Chairman Powell and how outspoken he has been on his concerns over cost overruns in this renovation?
Haley, correct me if I'm wrong, but today is Friday. And this seems a little bit like a Friday news dump to me. And I think it's something the president doesn't particularly want to talk about. He's happy to let this thing kind of slide into oblivion if that's indeed what happens. He took a tough line on the Fed, and now we all knew this was going to happen. If you wanted to get Warsh confirmed, you had something like this was going to have to happen. Here we are. It's happening. Judge Pirro seems to have come up with kind of a interesting deflection to send it over to the IG, where I expect it'll die a quiet death. And here we are.
Do you feel the same way, Adam, this dies a quiet death, or does Jay Powell finally step down, go into retirement, and be charged by Judge Jeanine?
I mean, I can't believe that Carolyn Leavitt would just take the win, take the W. It's on the table. To create more murkiness is just going to cause Tom Tillis to pause potentially even longer.
By allowing for this investigation to continue.
Potentially to continue.
And it's not ending, it's moving. Is that what you're referring to?
Potentially. But look, let's not lose sight of what has happened since Donald Trump came back to the White House. Mm-hmm. He has used the Department of Justice to go after his perceived enemies, whether they agree with him or oppose his policies, or he has some past personal grievances like Jim Comey, right? That has been the pattern. And so I think there's a real risk here that that is always the threat that is out there. And from the White House, the thing you want is Jay Powell to retire, to go off into the sunset, as you mentioned, to join. The Dead is
Dead and Company,
right?
I think, is go on tour. Yeah,
I think it's less likely that he does that if this threat hangs out there, and if the independence of the Fed truly does continue to be a problem. So I would, if I was in the White House, tell them just pump the brakes, let it go off into Friday. It won't be quiet here at Bloomberg, but let it die, and let you get your people on the Fed.
Well, I guess maybe there could be some voices inside the White House that are pushing for this, but as we all know, President Trump tends to make his own decisions and send his own messages. Again, we haven't heard directly from the president about this yet, not even anything on True Social. We also haven't heard from Republican Senator Thom Tillis. And I wonder, Lester, if we should be reading into that this wasn't, as soon as Jeanine Pirro made this announcement, sudden statement coming out from the senator's office saying, great, let's move forward on Kevin Warsh. Does the silence speak volumes here?
Well, I don't know that I go there yet, Kailey. If it's a few more days, maybe. But senators are elected to deliberate. They're not elected to react quickly to things. They kind of specialize in letting things simmer a little bit. But the other thing going on here, Senator Tillis took a hostage, right? He took this nomination as a hostage. He wrote a ransom note. That ransom note's been answered. I fully expect him to release the hostage here. That's standard Senate procedure. He doesn't have to do it immediately. He can wait a few days to do it, with a little bit of elegance perhaps. But that's what I expect to happen. And if it doesn't, then I think we're, then we really are kind of off the textbook and into kind of wild territory here.
All right. Well, I don't know how quickly we could actually see a confirmation vote. I think we've made pretty clear that the story isn't as simple as that. And knowing how difficult so much has been coming on Capitol Hill, I'd love to just hear from both of you on what's taken place in the last just even 24 to 48 hours. We sat here with Senator Bill Hagerty, who was going to fall asleep in his suit. They voted at 3:30 in the morning, as you well know, gentlemen, on what will be likely a framework for a reconciliation plan, the budget blueprint that now Speaker Johnson, House Republican leadership plan to unveil their framework next week. Bring us inside the House, Lester, because this has not been coming very easily. The Senate gets something done, the House rejects it because the Freedom Caucus doesn't like it, and Speaker Johnson can't even guarantee that he can get a vote on that Senate-passed plan. DHS has been shut down for over 60 days. How do we get out of this?
Well, it's shut down, but it isn't shut down. It's funded, but it's not funded. This has been one of the most nuanced, awkward government shutdowns we've ever had. Yes, it's lasted a long time, but the practical impacts are certainly not what they used to be, Joe. So there are some interesting politics here between the House and the Senate, of course. Very different bodies, even though they're both controlled by Republicans with a very thin margin for error here in both bodies. Mike Johnson has, I think at the end of the day, the hardest job in Washington, which is keeping that, whatever it is, 217 Republican votes at this point together so that he can pass things on the floor. He can afford to lose a couple of them, maybe, and then he's got a real problem. That is, it's not hurting cats; it's hurting mountain lions. And God bless him for showing up every day and trying to do that.
One guy who has been able to hurt lions has been Hakeem Jeffries, and what I heard from their office, just in the last 24, 48 hours, is that the DHS already got a lot of funding in the last reconciliation bill, right? They have more than enough money to do this. This does not need to be done. You will get 0 Democrats, I bet, to pass this legislation.
Well, speaking of getting 0, are Democrats not going to kind of have 0 to show for their fight shutting down this agency in the first place to get reforms to ICE? If Republicans are able to fund this thing via reconciliation or otherwise, with no reforms Democrats asked for included, is this not a loss?
I don't think of it that way. I think it a little bit more asymmetrically. We have fundamentally changed the politics of immigration over the last several months since this shutdown has happened by calling for and being very clear about what they want: masks, judicial warrants, and being and repeating that over and over and over again. We do not want ICE agents and other agents to be killing Americans on the streets. It's a very simple message, and it has flipped the script on immigration. The president is underwater on immigration now in a way he never was before. If Democrats played a neutral or positive on immigration, that gives us a real good chance of winning in the midterms.
Well, while we're hurting mountain lions here, Lester, what do we do with FISA? Because FISA Section 702 needs to be authorized within days. I believe 6 days from now. The reauthorization bill could get a vote next week, but Speaker Johnson can't seem to get that over the finish line either. Will he see an extension with the help of his Freedom Caucus?
Well, and maybe he can even do a kind of a drug deal with Hakeem Jeffries here and get some Democrats to come over and help him if he does something for them later down the road. This is a fraught vote. It's been a fraught vote for decades, really, a couple of decades. Yes. This has always been tough. They always find a way to do it at the end of the day. I would say, yes, things are very partisan right now, and each party's kind of looking to the advantage in the election. But let's recall, just a couple of months ago, Congress passed almost every single appropriations bill but one, the one for DHS, with bipartisan majorities. So there is a kind of an ocean under the surface here of bipartisanship on the way forward on some things that, we tend to ignore because we're focused on the fight, or we want to see the headline or the chyron of who's taken on who. But there is some interest in this Congress in doing things in a bipartisan way. If the Speaker can tap into that, if he can talk to Democrats across the aisle or his Freedom Caucus or both in a way that reflects that phenomenon from a couple months ago, he might be able to do this next week.
Just quickly, Adam, will Jeffries be able to get the votes on FISA if it's necessary to not let the program go dark?
I mean, I think if they can find some amendment to get it across the finish line, possibly. But let's not forget, when Democrats passed this last time under the Biden administration, we got some important reforms to the program. Mm-hmm. So I think there have been important changes that have been made. It's can you find and work in a bipartisan way to make the program even stronger? If they can, the votes are there. Mike Johnson has not been proven to be very capable of bridging that difference in his own caucus or with a Democrat. So we'll see.
We brought our panel into overtime. We had so much to talk about, and we thank you both. Lester Munson, BGR Group, and of course, Adam Hodge, Bloomberg Politics contributor, Bully Pulpit International. Many thanks, gentlemen, and have a great weekend. Don't do anything I wouldn't do at the White House Correspondents' Dinner. We have some important conversations coming up here as we turn back to the situation in the Middle East, geopolitics, and an extension of a ceasefire between Israel and Lebanon. Dan Williams will join us from our Jerusalem bureau, and our conversation with Michael Herzog, the former Israeli ambassador to the United States, all straight ahead. We want to keep tabs on Wall Street, and so let's hear from Charlie first, live from World Headquarters in New York. Charlie Pellet with his read on the markets.
Thank you very much indeed. Looking at a record right now on the S&P 500 index, on track for another winning week. If that happens, it will be 4 in a row, all about oil, all about the Middle East, and yes, Intel as well. Right now, we have got the S&P up 47, up by about 0.7%. Dow Industrials down 134, decline there of 0.3%. NASDAQ is surging 1.5% right now as Intel rallies after earnings, up by 21.7%. The VIX trading below 19 with a 10-year 4.30%, the 2-year 3.78%. Right now we have got West Texas Intermediate crude down 2.3%, 93.61 a barrel. Barrel of Brent down 0.4, 104.63. Gold up 0.6%, 47.22 the ounce on the precious metal. Keeping an eye on Intel shares hitting their highest level ever after the chipmaker delivered a sales forecast that shattered Wall Street expectations. Bears repeating, Intel right now up 21.8%. So again, recapping here, we got a retreat for crude. WTI now slumping by 2.4%. NASDAQ trading higher by 1.4%. S&P up 0.7%. For on-demand news 24 hours a day, subscribe to Bloomberg News Now wherever you get your podcast. Joe and Kailey, that is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, Charlie. Thank you, sir. Charlie Pellet live from New York. I'm Joe Mathieu alongside Kailey Leinz here in Washington. As we get ourselves back into geopolitics, we've spent so much time talking about the Fed, Kailey, and we know that we have some important news to talk about. Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner are getting back on a plane, it appears, making their way back to Islamabad for another round of talks with Iran. And Kailey, this comes after news yesterday when Israel and Lebanon announced a 3-week extension. I guess the President Trump, that is, announced it on their behalf, a 3-week extension of their ceasefire.
Yeah, that's right. And he said the leaders of both of those countries will be coming here in Washington in the coming weeks to talk about this. But clearly he is heralding that particular ceasefire as a victory. The question remains to what extent that is able to pave the way forward on any kind of long-term agreement between the U.S. and Iran, and whether talks this weekend can really advance that, Joe.
That's right. We've got Michael Herzog, the former Israeli ambassador to the United States, joining us shortly. We wanted to check in first with Dan Williams, Bloomberg News Jerusalem reporter. And Dan, it's great to have you with us here. The headline that we're seeing and the reaction from Hezbollah to this 3-week extension, they're calling the truce meaningless. How difficult will it be to maintain a ceasefire when Hezbollah is reacting in this way?
When Hezbollah says a truce is meaningless, it's significant because Hezbollah can still fire rockets. It can still attack Israeli forces in southern Lebanon, can still threaten Israeli communities in the north of the country. That is significant. So when we talk about the ceasefire in Lebanon, perhaps not quote marks, but it should really be recalled that there is a fine print attached to it, specifically a fine print allowing the Israelis to take action against perceived Hezbollah threats. Hezbollah not actually being a party to that ceasefire agreement, it's an agreement between the Israeli and Lebanese governments, not Hezbollah itself, means that, formally speaking, it's outside the ceasefire from the outset. The big question, what is the value of that announcement by President Trump, by the Vice President Vance, when those ambassadors met for a second time yesterday in Washington? What is the value of that announcement of the extension of 3 weeks? I think it's largely optical, but optics go a long way in the Middle East. Lebanese need a psychological boost, apparently, when it comes to potentially confronting Hezbollah internally, as they have committed to doing repeatedly in the past, but have yet to do, given the delicate power structure, the fact that Hezbollah remains armed and dangerous, potentially internally, as well as toward Israel. However, the fact is there are still laws in the books in Lebanon preventing Lebanese from engaging with Israelis, from talking about normalization with Israelis, and still envoys have been meeting openly with the Israelis, and apparently, as you noted, the Lebanese leader may even meet with the Israeli prime minister in Washington. The optics here are important in that they may give enough of a boost to the Lebanese eventually to find some sort of arrangement, perhaps with the help of the US and Israel, to defanging Hezbollah and pushing all sides toward a peaceable, perhaps even a peace treaty in the near future.
Well, it's certainly incredible to consider when we think about whether or not a wider treaty between the U.S. and Iran can be reached in the near future, and whether negotiations, another round of them this weekend in Islamabad, can advance that. Obviously, Israel does not have a seat at that particular negotiating table. It's not recognized by Pakistan, where these talks are happening, is one issue. Dan, do we have a sense as to what exactly Israel's objectives are, and in the confidence that the Israeli government has in U.S. negotiators to defend their position and get the optimal outcome, not just for the United States, but for Israel too?
Well, the Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu issued a statement just before the Jewish Sabbath a few hours ago saying that Israel and the United States are fully coordinated on these matters. Israel is the junior partner in this war. It has been from the outset. It is not the superpower here. The United States is. So Trump from the outset has been calling the shots. And I think the Israelis have said so openly. Only a few weeks ago, the Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu said at a press conference that Trump is the quote-unquote leader of this operation against Iran, and Israel is the quote-unquote ally or the junior partner. So what the U.S. decides is what will happen. For now, formally, openly, the allies are pretty much on the same page in terms of core demands. A verifiable end to the Iranian nuclear program, which would entail also the removal of that highly enriched uranium, what remains in Iran, some 460 kilograms of 60% enriched uranium, and basically, of course, an opening of the Strait of Hormuz, which is a development not foreseen at the outset of this war, but certainly one that's sitting on international energy operators and on world powers. One development, one issue that has been apparently overlooked or has been pushed to the side by the negotiators is the ballistic program of Iran. That no longer appears to be on the table as a core immediate demand. I imagine, however, that were Iran to give up its nuclear program, were it to reopen Hormuz, it would effectively see what remains of its ballistic missiles as a regime protection weapon, not to be easily expended against enemies, certainly not initiated wars, especially as we're told that the damage inflicted on Iran has included severe damage to the production line for missiles in the future. So the ballistic missiles remaining in the Iranian arsenal, presumably, are the ones that remain and will simply not be supplemented because the Iranians may not have the ability in the foreseeable future to do so.
All right, Dan, thank you so much. Bloomberg's Dan Williams reporting live late night for us from Jerusalem on this Friday. Thank you so much. We really appreciate it. And we want to continue this conversation now as we turn to the former Israeli ambassador to the United States. Michael Herzog is joining us live on Bloomberg TV and radio. Ambassador, thank you for being here. To pick up where we just left off with Dan, the notion that in talks in Islamabad this weekend being led on the U.S. side by Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner, Israel will not have a formal seat at the table. As the U.S. side tries to make progress in a deal with Iran, is anything that they are willing to agree to at this point acceptable to Israel, or are there minimum conditions for the Israelis that must be met here?
Well, first, I believe that the fact that the parties are going back to Islamabad to negotiate indicates that they have an interest in diplomacy and don't want to go back to war. As far as Israel is concerned, I believe Israel will go along with whatever diplomatic outcome the U.S. goes for. As was mentioned, we are not at the table, and it's for the U.S. administration to determine the outcome. However, there are close consultations between the Israeli and the U.S. governments where Israel indicates its interest. And one area I would emphasize, I think it was mentioned by your reporter, is the issue of the ballistic missiles. That was one of the main reasons Israel decided to launch the war against Iran, because the way they built their ballistic missile program constituted a serious strategic threat to the state of Israel. There's concern in Israel that if the deal does not include limitations on the numbers and on the range of Iranian ballistic missiles, they will rebuild their capabilities, and we'll have to find ourselves fighting another war in a few years. So it remains to be seen if and to what extent this is included in the negotiations.
From your experience as a peace negotiator, Ambassador, how much confidence does Israel have in Jared Kushner and Steve Witkoff at the negotiating table?
Well, I know them personally. I think they are very capable negotiators, and they are the ones that brought about a deal in Gaza that released all of Israel's hostages. But ultimately, diplomacy is dictated by political interest. As far as while we were fighting Iran together, shoulder to shoulder, Israel and the United States, we're almost fully aligned. When diplomacy speaks, I do see some gaps. But as I said, ultimately, it is for the United States to determine the outcome. And you have a very challenging Iranian negotiator, and I'm not sure Iranians are capable of taking decisions right now, given the turmoil inside Iran in their decision-making process.
Well, to that exact point, Ambassador, that's also what President Trump cited when he extended the ceasefire indefinitely, what he called a fracture in Iran's leadership. You obviously have the new supreme leader who no one hears from very frequently, the IRGC, and then the political leadership. Can any of them credibly be agreeing to a long-term deal at this point? Is it something that, even if it can be reached and negotiated out, is likely to hold when we're seeing such fractures?
That's an excellent question. I do see some major gaps in the positions of between the United States and Iran on the major issues, on the nuclear issue, on Hormuz, on other issues as well. And I'm not sure there are people in Iran who are capable of bridging those gaps and taking the necessary decisions. So either diplomacy will fail, or the parties might go for a very limited diplomatic outcome, which will allow for extending the ceasefire, possibly opening the Strait of Hormuz, because without that, I don't see any deal. And some kind of an arrangement regarding the high-enriched uranium, which the United States, for good reason, wants to be shipped out of Iran. There are several possible solutions, and possibly other issues will just be postponed or kicked down the road.
Ambassador, there's a lot of reporting about the munitions stockpiles here in the United States that need to be replenished, the number of missiles and interceptors that have been fired already in the course of this war. The New York Times today, in fact, says the U.S. has burned through 1,100 long-range stealth cruise missiles built for a war with China, firing off more than 1,000 Tomahawk cruise missiles, 10 times the number we buy each year. And the Pentagon has used more than 1,200 Patriot interceptor missiles in the war, something that Israel knows quite a bit about. To what extent is Israel facing a similar need to replenish stockpiles in this conflict?
Well, there's no doubt that Israel burnt a lot of munitions during this war. And we have to remember, we are at war since October 7, 2023. And we've been fighting on numerous fronts in Gaza, in Lebanon, against the Houthis, against Iran, in Syria and elsewhere. So definitely a lot was burnt, and this is a challenge. Israel's government recently, our Ministry of Defense, just signed some contracts to accelerate the production of the necessary munitions because war may not be over. So that is definitely something that our government is giving a lot of thought to.
You mentioned Lebanon, Ambassador. President Trump did announce the extension by 3 weeks of the current ceasefire between Israel and Lebanon. But Hezbollah obviously remains a factor separate to the Lebanese government. What is your degree of confidence that Hezbollah is willing to abide and cooperate in some kind of longer-term fashion?
Well, the fact is that since the first ceasefire was announced in Lebanon, Hezbollah has not abided by the ceasefire. They've been firing every day, mostly at Israeli forces in southern Lebanon, but also sent some drones trying to infiltrate Israel's territory. They do not see themselves bound by this ceasefire, but ultimately I think the announcement of the extension of the ceasefire is important in that it gives space to the governments of Israel and Lebanon. Both of them are aligned in the goal of disarming Hezbollah. So it gives them space to start negotiations. The ultimate goal is, of course, peace deal and normalization between Israel and Lebanon. But before that, we have to reach a security arrangement that will enable the Lebanese government and Lebanese armed forces to disarm Hezbollah. Mm-hmm. The challenge was always the balance of power between them. The Lebanese army did not feel strong enough facing Hezbollah. So the key point here is to change that balance, to weaken Hezbollah on the one hand and to strengthen the Lebanese government on the other hand, and that is the goal of the process.
All right, Ambassador, I'm afraid we're out of time. Michael Herzog, thank you so much for sharing your insights. This is Balance of Power, only on Bloomberg.